All right. All right. We are live and I'm super pumped. Tonight I'm joined by Ray Williams. Say what's up.
Hey guys, happy to be here. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's
Yeah.
there's there's so many things to talk about.
Yes. So I have a million questions for Ray. You're actually I feel like I'm talking to a freaking celebrity right now because I've been following your Detrans story since you started posting about it. So maybe we could start there for some audience that isn't as creepy and obsessed as I am. So maybe you can tell us what made you decide to go public with your story, especially knowing all the risks that it could that go along with that.
Yeah, it's a good question because my wife and I talked extensively prior to me sort of talking about all this. Talking about detransition. Um, kind of critiquing gender ideology, talking about AGP because there's all these trans activists who are ready to pounce on people for speaking against this, being critical of this, any whiff of gender criticality, basically. And so, I work in corporate, and my livelihood, is what supports our family. And so, it was like a big decision because, there's this massive cancel culture in the trans
Mhm.
activist world, and Twitter mobs and all this stuff. So, but we like talked about it, and it was basically truth to power. Like, this is something we care
Mhm.
about, and we just wanted to like share the truth, and it kind of have to be the change you want to see in terms of
Mm.
if we want to, because I think that there's like a silent majority of people who are on the fence or critical or open-minded to being critical, but they're scared to speak out, particularly on the left and the liberal circles. I think there's a lot of liberal people out there who, you know, may have some questions, but they're just scared of speaking out because they don't want to be labeled transphobic, because that's like, the worst thing in the world these days is to be called a transphobe. And
Mhm.
so, like, yeah, it's just, so that's kind of the big impetus. When I first started on YouTube, it was just like, I'm just going to talk about my detransition, purely autobiographical. I'm going to not critique anything. It's
Mm.
just like share my journey, share my journey.
Mhm.
But then eventually, as the more I got into it, I was like, okay, well, I kind of need to talk about the ideological aspects and the culture war
Mm.
aspects, and critique this system. And then from there, I was just like, kind of fuck it, like, and
Yeah.
and
So
so
is your
far haven't been. Oh, go ahead.
oh no, sorry. I was gonna ask, so that's really great. You have like a supportive wife, and I don't know if you have any kids along in the picture, but I didn't
No,
know you.
no, no, no kids.
I didn't
I am married.
yes, I follow. I know like some bits and pieces of the story just from following, but I wasn't positive about the kid part. Um, but yeah, I find that really interesting because I didn't know that you worked in a corporation. So that's actually even feels like a bigger threat for you. Because for me, even as someone with virtually nothing to lose, speaking about it the first couple times, I just kind of like was like, you know what? I'm going to just tell the truth about what I feel in this moment. I can be wrong. That's okay. But like, I've done a lot of research and I'm really feeling like something's going on that isn't being talked about fully or honestly, especially in my social groups coming from a more far left creative type of background where I've much higher like proportion of like trans people in my life. So it's very been a part of my social circle. And I like started having these kind of creeping thoughts and questions that I pushed down for a long time because I was like, that's transphobia, that's transphobia. Like, but once I started kind of more engaging with it, it became almost an obsession of just like, I really feel like I want to know the truth of what is going on with this issue. Like, what, why is it so like making me so distraught that I can't wrap my head around where I stand on certain things. Like I care about a lot of trans people in my life, but then I find myself holding these views that they find to be against their existence. So it puts me in kind of a weird spot with that. So, but props to you,
Yeah,
for
I I
having
to-
so
I
much on the
totally
line.
I totally relate to that, and my wife does as well, because me less so, because I just don't have that many friends.
Oh.
But her whole like social world, is like, the local queer community, and they're all, you know they're all on board, with the trans stuff, the like gender identity ideology. So that was a huge decision, not just like, am I going to get canceled and like lose my job, but like, are we going to be ostracized from our local community? Are we going to be like pariahs? Like, can we show our faces, like in anywhere, in the city in regards to, different queer events? Because, my wife is, still part of the queer community. She's bi, and so we still want to be part of the queer community in some respects. And like, but it's just like, there's not a lot of people where, you know, like that kind of, those worlds are entangled together.
Mm.
And when we sort of like have found a few people who are local, who are critical of all this, who are, queer or whatever, but it's a small community, I feel like. So, and also, it's in this town, everyone knows everyone. So, and so,
Yeah, that makes it really scary, especially like for me, it took me a long time in life to find a community where I felt like I belonged. So I was really hesitant to do anything to jeopardize that, especially when I had doubts like, am I even right? Like maybe I'm just not getting something. Like I'm not getting something. So I really like tamped that down for a while until the point where now, like where I'm at with a lot of the trans issue is I'm wanting to understand more along the I'm very curious about like AGP, what percent of trans people have AGP, what percent of trans people benefit from transitioning, what age is safe to do that. And then I have some more hard lines around like cis women's spaces I care about. And like all those basic things, but not like bathrooms I don't really care about. And like I'm not as I'm not like full blown turfy. But I have some gender critical tendencies that I know just even saying something like, maybe not puberty blockers, that would be enough where I know certain friends would probably shun me for that. Like, just dabbling with like, oh, maybe this is, I don't know, like it's just so freaking radioactive, the whole topic. But that's why I have a similar desire to de-radioactivize it by throwing myself into the fire a little bit, and
right.
trying to find other people to drag down with me, basically.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because, the trans activists, they've moralized the situation and used very extreme moral language. So they use morality as a bludgeon to shut down, conversation. And they'll use language like, blood is on your hands.
Mm,
Like, oh, if you're skeptical of pediatric gender medicine at all, any respect, they'll say like, oh, you have the blood of trans
mhm.
kids on your hands. You are advocating for trans genocide. You want to kill trans children. Like, you must hate trans people. You must be a terrible
It goes so
bigot.
extreme
And
so quick.
yeah, it's like very extreme moralistic language. And I and it's an effective tactic. This is
Mm,
something my wife talks about a lot, and something that she's explored in the gender critical world. There's this concept of an empathy trap, and there's kind of like a
mm,
lot of theoretical, baggage behind where that term comes from. But the long and short of it is that empathy becomes weaponized because you hear these stories of, there's these people who are suffering from gender dysphoria. They're really suffering. They're marginalized. They're oppressed. They're
mhm,
ostracized. Hear all these stories about violence and discrimination. It's like, and like these sort of bleeding heart liberals, they have
mhm,
empathy for those people. And so you sort of feel like you can't criticize anything because what you
mhm.
like you're a bigot. Like, so it's just becomes very extreme.
Yeah, I've heard that in the like empathy hacking and especially how women can be vulnerable to that being like our tendency. And I've become so I used to be more of like a blank slatey kind of person, but I've gone kind of more the other way because just by being interested in this topic, I've done a lot of research on sex differences and I find them fascinating. And I don't find them to be limiting to any one individual, the fact that patterns exist. But broadly speaking, women tend to have more pro-social empathetic behaviors that can be weaponized against them. And the Liberal Party does kind of have like a it sounds so like reductive to say like, yeah, it has like a more feminine way of running things and enforcing social rules and norms. And the female way of doing that is to social sabotage. So I just feel like there's so many levels to which there's like the sex differences are relevant to like this debate. But yeah, specifically with like the empathy hacking and like the empathy trap and just like things like that. But I wonder why, like, all right. So first question that we kind of talked a little on Twitter about this, but there's so much more I want to know about it. We were talking about what percent of like say let's just talk about trans women specifically, just because it's so complicated. I also want to talk about trans trans men too, and like autoandrophilia, and like I do want to touch on that too for sure. But oh shit, I just lost it for a second. Sorry. I had
What
like
percentage
oh yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
trans
Thank you. You're
women
my hero. You're my hero.
have AGP? Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So
Yes.
this
Yeah.
is a very interesting question because it kind of cuts to the heart of the issue. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you talk to someone like Phil Illey, who's done the research on this, they will say that, or he will say that 80% of trans women in the West. So why the West? Well, in the East, for example, in Thailand, ladyboys, like
Mm-hmm.
there's that the phenomenon of transgenderism is more coming from the homosexual type. And you have to
Uh-huh.
understand this in the context of the Blanchardian two type typology theory, which is the fundamental basis for understanding this. Because if you buy into that theory, there's two types of trans women. There's the homosexual type, who are exclusively attracted to men, have always been attracted to men since a young age. So they've always known they're attracted to men. And then there's everyone else who's
Mm-hmm.
asexual, bisexual, and and heterosexual, defined relative to your birth sex. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, are you gynephilic? Like, if you like women at all,
Mm-hmm.
then on this theory you are you fit into the autogynephilic pathway, because the origin of the theory comes from clinical observation. So this guy, Ray Blanchard, he was in a gender clinic, and people were coming to him, trans women were coming to him seeking transition services, and it was his job to sort of like give the gatekeeping rubber stamp in terms of like insurance approval in the Canadian healthcare system. And so he noticed in his clinical observations that there's kind of these trans women fall in two different camps, and it's in terms of like a lot of like the behavioral profiles are different. So the homosexual type are usually much more naturally feminine. They usually know from a young age. This is kind of your like classical transsexual who's like known from a young age, interested in boys and like makeup and dress up from like a young age.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like the other camp, the what he called the autogynephilic type, and they usually transition later. They know later. They often, it's very common, they are married. With, they're like married to a woman. They like transition in their 40s and 50s.
So like a Caitlyn Jenner, that
Yeah,
kind of
like
that's prototypical
Caitlyn Jenner, classic
classic.
example.
Yeah.
And then so, and once you sort of like know what to look for, it's sort of like, it's just hard to not see it manifested in these different personality types and these sort of AGP type, more classical masculine interests, computer science. There's kind of like this old joke that like trans women are either like sex workers or they're like working computer science. Well,
I have noticed that a lot. That does ring true to me in my experience.
Yeah. So if you buy into this basic typological theory, then there's two different types. And so to derive the 80% number, you just have to you just have to do a demographic survey on what is the sexual orientation of the trans women population. And 80% of trans women are either asexual, bisexual, or heterosexual. And so that's where you get the number. Now, a lot of trans activists will admit to autogynephilia being a legitimate phenomenon, but they'll say, well, that's a phenomenon of like the fetishists, the men, the
Mm,
people who identify explicitly as autogynephilias, or the sort of the clearly transvestic cross-dressing type who, they like haven't transitioned, they don't want hormones,
mhm,
they're purely transvestic
mhm.
cross-dressing,
It's like,
and they'll
yeah.
say like they are the autogynephiles. But if you are a trans woman who's transitioned, you're
Mhm,
on hormones, you seek out surgeries, they'll say like, oh well, those aren't the AGPs, those are the transsexuals.
mhm,
But it is a false distinction, because when Barry Blanchard did his theory, um, the AGP type were seeking out transition services. They were seeking out transsexual medical interventions like HRT and surgeries.
yeah.
And a lot of how AGP manifests, there are some AGPs for whom it entirely focuses on the clothing. So that would be your sort of
Mhm,
classic transvestic um, A- AGPs. But there are some AGPs for whom they have no interest in the clothing, and it's all about the anatomy.
mhm,
So you can be AGP, and your only really interest is in seeking out bottom surgery. That's like your only thing that you're all about, is just you have this sexual fantasy, like in your sexual fantasy, like you always imagine you can't get off except by imagining yourself with a vagina.
uh-huh.
And that's like the sole focus of like the sexual fantasy.
Yeah, it seems like there's so much, like, a diversity in the way that these things, like, manifest. Because 'cause I've done a lot of, like, just browsing on, like, message boards, listening to a lot of individual stories, and there are a lot of, like, similar patterns, but there it does seem to be a lot of variation in the specific ways, like you're saying about, is it, like, about the clothing? Is it about the physicality? Is it about the mannerisms? Is it about the being perceived? Is it about getting fucked by a guy like a girl? Like, there's so many different ways that specifically, like, get that person off, for lack of a better term right now. Um, but so are you not a trans truther, as they say?
What does
Like,
that mean
okay,
exactly?
so a trans, like, like the whole true trans thing. Because I probably lean towards maybe being true trans, that, like, okay, there is something called gender dysphoria that can exist maybe independently from I'm kind of thinking this out as I go, but do you know what I mean? There's like to bring it back to like the gender critical space, there is a debate about if anyone is truly trans in the way that we use that word publicly. Like, do you think that there is a condition called being transgender in which the treatment should be to transition through surgery and hormones? Period. Just curious. Not to
It's a
put you on the
complicated.
spot. I know
It's
it's
like
very complicated.
it's like a complicated question, and there's a lot of different ways to address this. One is like, okay, is there such a thing as true trans? Well, now let's do some philosophy. How do we define terms? Like, how do terms derive their definitions?
Mm,
Is transgender a medical condition? In which case, it like all medical diagnoses are socially constructed. The DSM is full of socially constructed medical categories that are,
mhm.
developed through observations of symptoms. And
So
so
by that
there's
standard,
sort of collections of symptoms. And yes, and
yeah.
so is there a symptom of
Mm.
people who hate their genitalia?
Mhm. Yeah, pretty much.
And that, to me, there are definitely are people who hate their genitalia.
Mhm.
They hate their sexed body characteristics. Now, the true transgender critical debate, they want to say that, well, the reason why they hate their genitalia is because of these environmental influences. And if they weren't exposed to these environmental influences, so they'll say
Mm.
it's all nurture, there's no nature to it. I
Ah.
think for any complex psychological phenomenon, such as hating your genitals, it is inevitably going to have, just like every other complex psychological trait, there's always going to be a mixture of nature and nurture.
Mm.
I just don't think anything that complicated
Mm.
psychologically is going to be wholly nurture based or wholly nature based. So the idea of true trans, well, there's some underlying psychological phenomenon. Now, a lot of the true trans people or the anti-true trans people will say the way in which the category of gender dysphoria is defined in the DSM is problematic because it's based in gender identity theory. So they'll say like, oh, well, you have this like cross-sex gender identity, and they'll say, oh, there's no such thing as trans people. There's just confused homosexual people.
Oh.
But those quote unquote confused homosexual people often have the symptom of hating their sex body characteristics, in which case, okay, no, is that gender dysphoria? Well, they don't like the term gender dysphoria because they think gender is a social construct. This is called like sex dysmorphia. But it's like, for me, we're in the world of debating semantics, which I don't like to debate semantics, because that's a pointless thing. We're just debating what words mean. But empirically, there definitely are people who hate their sex body characteristics, and I would classify that as, transgenderism, the phenomenon of there being people who historically we have used the word transgender or transsexual to pick out those particular people who have this unique phenomenon where they hate their bodies.
So the second part of the question would be, because I'm still just reading, trying to figure out what I believe on like what causes transgender, what all these things. And like I kind of settled on that like concept that like maybe like it has to do with like hormones in utero, like maybe you get an influx of masculizing or feminizing hormones in utero that can affect your brain, and perhaps that causes both homosexuality and transsexuality. Is that because they found that there was that study that trans people like to talk about a lot about the brain scans, which really doesn't tell us much of anything except that trans women, cis women, and gay men all have similar places light up in their mind. So sorry, I just veered off in two different ways. So you could either, well, I'm curious, I'll take it back to simplicity. Do you ever think it's beneficial to go through like hormones or gender reassignment surgery?
So I think that in my experience, from just like, not just in my personal experience, like knowing lots of trans people in like real life, but also like just sort of, I'm like one of those people who's like very curious and is on Reddit all the time, just like reading people's stories and like and just like kind of observing, like lurking in communities and like,
same.
and in my experience, there definitely seems to be people who, if you take them pre-transition and then post-transition, they seem much more psychologically well-adjusted post-transition. Now there's questions about like, okay, well, it is the concept of regret, it's like complicated, because if you had asked me, for example, in 1 year in transition, do I have regrets? I'd be like, no, of course not. I'm super happy. 8 years later, I detransitioned. So, if we're just relying on studies of regrets, like that's complicated in terms of like how we do follow-ups and measurements and all this stuff. But the more basic question of like, is there ever any trans people who transition who are more well-adjusted psychologically? And we can define what it means to be well-adjusted psychologically in a variety of different ways. But like, to me, it seems like, yes, there are people who, are going to benefit from these medical interventions. Now, these sort of like gender critical people want to say like, well, we don't treat any other psychiatric illness by treating the body. We always treat the brain. So, if you have, body dysmorphia or anorexia, we don't like treat the body. We like treat the brain. Well, unfortunately, we are, to my knowledge, we don't have a pill that treats gender dysphoria. We don't have a brain surgery that treats gender dysphoria. Now, 100 years into the future, will scientists invent a pill that you can pop and just like cure this? To me, that seems more ideal than the all the sort of hardships of transition, which are hard on the
Mhm.
body and causes a
True.
lot of psychosocial distress, the whole passing process, the early transition process. It's not easy to be a trans person. You experience a lot of
Mm.
discrimination. So is it like the ideal treatment for this phenomenon of like hating your body? Like, Jules, that's actually my wife.
Oh, no way. Hey.
She says there's no pill for anorexia or body dysmorphia either, though. Yeah, I mean that's a good point.
Mm.
But like, so yeah. I mean, and this kind of goes to the question of like, should the gender affirming model, which is all about sort of like not attempting to treat gender dysphoria with you know uh therapy or something, like
Mhm.
as like a first line response,
Mm.
because we can sort of think about this sort of gender dysphoria, this hatred of the body, and coming in a spectrum. There's some people for whom maybe their hatred from their body is due to the fact that, particularly for females, they like
Mm.
had sexual trauma or internalized misogyny, or the patriarchy, or something. They hate their bodies because of internalized misogyny or trauma or something. Or they like maybe some people hate their bodies because of like autism, and some people,
Mhm.
they don't even hate their bodies. They're only pulled into it through gender dysphoria, in which case it's not even a
Mm.
medical condition. It's just like it's a way to have a gender journey and be your true self.
Yeah.
But so there's a spectrum, but there's on the extreme end of the spectrum, there's going to be people who are have such a strong hatred of their body. If you don't give them these treatments,
Mm.
they're liable to like self mutilate.
Mm.
They're
Actually,
gonna
like,
like
try to, like, cut, things off. That's
yeah.
so
um,
yeah, because 'cause I'm with you, and this is the part I really struggle with is that yeah, the line of questioning of, like, what other psychological issue would we treat in this way? So the way my current, viewpoint, if I was the one creating the standard of care, would be, definitely lots of therapy, lots of gatekeeping and safeguarding, and then, like, doing cosmetic surgeries, hormones as, like, the last option. That's kind of where I'm at, and even that would be really upsetting, um, to a lot of the trans community, and so another question I have for you is kinda like, how do you think we got to this kind of anti-realist place in the conversation that we're just so lost in the sauce? Like, do you think, like, would you agree that maybe the movement, like, trans people did have interests to advocate for to some degree, and they had an interest in advocating for themselves to be respectable members of society, and that did involve gaining some visibility, and, I support all that, but I just
so
yeah, you
in
can
my book,
touch
I
off
talk
that.
about these three waves of trans activism. So the first wave of trans activism is like your Christine Jorgensens, who sort of, just like the trailblazers, the pioneers, just like novel. And they're just sort of like, they're like advocating for just like, hey, I exist. This is a
Yeah.
thing. The
Yeah.
second wave of trans activism is a sort of like the assimilationist model, where they want to, with, and this is when you could only get access to these treatments through going through the gatekeeping process. And it was a real
Mm.
gatekeeping process, not this
Mhm.
sort of quasi gatekeeping they have now. You had to do the real life experience.
Mhm.
You had to like, transition for, 2 years, real
Mhm.
life experience. You had to get a job.
Mhm.
And the requirement was you had to hold down a steady job for 2 years prior to even getting hormones
Wow.
in um, your
Living as the
does
gender you
yeah,
desire to be.
yeah. And the reason why they do this is because it requires a certain amount of psychological and mental stability in order to
Mm.
hold down a job, because they didn't want to give these treatments to people who were not psychologically stable. And
And to make sure
furthermore,
they could work in that state, like, be
right.
hired,
Yeah.
function in society, that's
And
important.
And for the most part, they would only give this to people who were passable without hormones. So
Ah.
they wouldn't, like, if you could not go deep stealth,
Mm.
they would not allow you to transition. Like, deep stealth assimilation as a heterosexual, good standing member of society was the criteria by which they judged whether or not your transition was a success, and they had
Mhm.
gatekeeping measures. Okay, so that's like the second wave, this assimilation model. The third wave is what I call the sort of like, for lack of a better term, the non-binary gender fucking, like,
Mhm.
queer theory activist mode, where it sort of takes that model of successful heterosexual assimilation into society and say like, oh, that's heteronormative.
Yeah.
That's cis normative. That's using cis straight people as the gold standard by which to judge whether or not your life is valid. And so the activists got involved, the queer activists, queer
Mhm.
theory, Judith Butler, queer theory in the 90s, the sort of like radical activism. They say like, we want to deconstruct all those norms about, being a good, upstanding, assimilated member of society. And so now it's about, and this is where people like Julia Serrano came into the picture, these trans
Uh-huh.
activists, trans feminism, where they say like cis normativity is saying, or like attacking cis normativity, then
Mhm.
now it's like, rather than cis people being the gold standard, trans people are their own standard. So
Mhm.
trans people don't need to act like cis people, look like cis people,
Mhm.
pass like cis people. And the very concept of passing as trans is considered transphobic.
It's so
So
interesting.
so now we get into this whole
Mm.
activist world where like we're questioning all these assumptions.
And
Um,
did you feel like you were a part of the activist world, or were you kind of in it like just by default through your own transition?
sorry,
Did
could
you
you repeat that? I
no, I was just curious. Did you were you a part of the activist world like before your like how did you
No,
end up
no.
in that
I
space? Like I'm curious.
Well, I think it's like prior to my transition, I was yeah, I don't know. I guess I was like a Obama Democrat. Like that was
Mhm.
like the extent of my activism. I was not really an
Gotcha.
activist per se. I was just like, I was a philosopher. I was in grad school. I was
Mhm.
interested in like the life of the mind. I
Mhm.
thought like, activism was like, that's like applied ethics. I'm interested in like, consciousness and,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
all these things. But when I transitioned, I had what would call what's called a feminist awakening, which is very common in the trans women community, where or in the trans community, where okay, so I was like a quote unquote cis straight white male, top of the privilege hierarchy,
Yeah, yeah.
and then I transitioned. Suddenly I'm in this marginalized class, and so I got like plugged into this like liberation activist movement, such that now I'm like fighting for fighting for the rights of marginalized people, and I sort of became an intersectional feminist. Prior
Yeah,
to
because
this,
it's all linked up, you
yeah,
know.
like prior to my transition, I guess what I would be called like a classical liberal
Mhm.
humanist. I was always like, no, I'm not a feminist. I'm a humanist. I care
Yeah.
about all humans, and then later I learned, oh, that's actually bad. You're not supposed to say that. Like, you're supposed to,
Yeah.
you're supposed to care about the most marginalized people.
You learn
And
quickly, you know.
yeah, and then once I got into, once I transitioned, yeah, I just got, interested in like, I got to fight cis normativity and like, and then that connected to like, all the other critical theories, critical
Mhm.
social justice theories.
Mhm.
Like there's critical race theory, there's queer theory, there's fat studies, there's post-colonial studies,
Mhm.
there's ableist studies, there's
Mhm.
all these isms and intersectionalities that you sort of analyze everything in terms of standpoint epistemology. So
Mhm.
you can only talk about transphobia if you're trans. You can only talk about racism if you're a person of color. You can only talk about disability if you're disabled. You can only talk about fatness if you're
Mhm.
fat. And it's just like you have to have the right identity and the right combination, and whoever has the most stacked up identities that are marginalized, that person, we need to put all our efforts on liberating them from these oppressive systemic structures. And like, so that's what that's kind of the mindset and it's like a natural, that's very common in the trans community. So yeah.
So when you transitioned, were you in school while you transitioned?
Yeah, I was in my 5th year of grad school.
Did you
oh, go ahead.
did you feel, I'm curious, maybe we can get into some of the, like, what you feel influenced you to take those steps, to transition. Did you feel like you were getting ideas from school, from porn? Was this something you had always struggled with or felt? If you wanted to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, totally. So, I have autogynephilia, so I'm one of those creepy, perverted AGPs.
I love the
Um,
AGPs.
but I had, been cross-dressing from a very young age. So I'd always been interested in women's clothing. And this had a fetishistic aspect. So when I was very little, the first sort of, I was like, my mind was latched onto a particular type of clothing. It was hosiery. And there's just something about the tactile sensations of hosiery, like really sort of like, I don't know if it was like some kind of Freudian like association, because a lot of like these theories about how fetishes about particular objects form, they're kind of like like you were very young and you like touched a rubber duck while you had randomly had a boner, so now like for the rest of your life, like your unconscious mind associates rubber ducks and like boners. Same thing with like latex, or these sort of, they're very tactile. It's like something about the feeling of latex, or well, for me it was like hosiery.
That's very common. Like in my experience doing like some adult work, was that people do very often fetishize like a type of clothing, and hosiery is very common. There is something like the texture,
like high heels.
Yeah.
And it ties into taboo. I think part of it is because like hosiery is extremely feminine coded. Like you don't form these sorts of like fetishes about things like blue jeans, because blue jeans are a unisex item, but like high heels, hosiery, stockings, they're extremely feminine coded, so they're taboo for males to wear or associate with. So I think that's part of the AGP focus, is like what's taboo relative to what is policed, by because femininity in males is highly policed. Like you, and particularly in like my home environment where I grew up in a Christian home, so like any expression of femininity was like not, it was just like implicitly and explicitly discouraged.
I'm sure. And then like I'm sure like in school, like other male, I saw like how my brothers were treated in school for being maybe a little different, like, and they were called faggot, blah blah blah, this and that. Like maybe I shouldn't say that for you too, but what they were called all the names, and it's like any variation from like being super masculine can be very strictly enforced.
Yeah, no, it's very, very common. So then as I got older, when I, got my first car, it's like, now I can go to like the Sears department store and buy my own hosiery.
Yeah.
So that was a big step in my life, when I could like, buy my own like women's clothing. And then like in high school, I discovered like pornography, and then I was on the internet as like every young horny boy, like looking at I was like on my like dial-up modem, like
Same. I remember
like,
the modem. I remember like hiding. We had like
know.
a family computer, and like it was in like a computer room with the dial-up, and like I would sneak in there like at night and like hope no one was coming, go in like chat rooms, be like, just whatever, just be doing the weirdest shit on the internet for many years now.
Yeah, I had my own computer in my room, but my mom tried to install like this like porn blocker or whatever.
No, that's so embarrassing. Why did your mom
However,
know?
well, it was just like one of those things where
Or just like
it was like a Christian, it was like Christian software that you just sort of like,
so she probably just had
however,
it.
as a young little whippersnapper, I downloaded a keylogger And I
Oh
was like, "Hey,
shit.
mom, I need you to put this website on the whitelist. Can you type in the password?" And I keylogged the password, and then I bypassed it for years while she was paying for it.
Oh my gosh. Sneaky little
Uh,
minx.
yeah.
So so once you're like in like grad school, was the porn thing that these are all just kind of like influenced? Do you ever feel like you got out of control addicted to porn, or was that just one of many influences you feel like that kind of brought you to the point where you were like, all right, I'm going to pursue this?
Well, it was particularly, I think every young boys, they like their friend's dad is like a playboy and they're looking at porn or
Hmm.
whatever. But it was when I discovered transgender pornography, it really changed
Mm.
everything. Because then for the first time, that was how I became aware of trans people. And also, random on like Jerry Springer, like Ace
Yeah.
Ventura, the sort of like, pop cultural references. I sort of like, but the transgender pornography, like, and this is part of the AGP, because AGP is the like classic phenomenon with autosexuality is you you're attracted to someone, but then there's a simultaneously feeling of like, am I attracted to you or do I want to be you?
Mm.
Now, most AGPs, or I don't know, I think it's actually like probably half and half, but it's very they are that attracted to, or B, that attraction B, like dichotomy, exists for female anatomy. So they're attracted
Oh.
to vaginas and they want the vagina at the same
Hmm.
time. That's the inverted heterosexuality. Now, in my case, I was attracted to the sort of transsexual woman, so the chick with the dick, basically.
Uh-huh.
So I was attracted to that and I wanted to be that. So that's why I never had bottom dysphoria, why I never got
Oh.
I never wanted bottom surgery, because I was specifically,
Specifically that.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
I've read that
so
other people having that, and honestly, thank God for that, that didn't take you down that path of getting a surgery that would probably have many
yeah,
complications and you would regret now, obviously.
yeah,
So,
totally.
that's very fortunate.
But that phenomenon of having that sort of fetishistic attraction to trans women is called gynoandromorphophilia. And
Oh,
then the autosexual version of that is called
okay.
autogyneandromorphophilia.
So would that be more specifically how you identify? Like, if you wanted to be, like,
Yes.
hyper specific? But that
Yes.
word
I would,
autogynephilia is barely in the public consciousness, so we
yes.
don't wanna throw
That's,
that would be,
yeah.
like, way too many syllables.
So, but for some people, their autogynemorphophilia or whatever is like
Uh-huh.
the entirety of their sexuality is such that they're incapable of regular heterosexual attraction. For me, it was never that black and white. I still, capable of like normal, regular heterosexual attraction, such
Uh-huh.
that my sexuality was not entirely autosexual. For some AGPs, it is
Oh.
entirely autosexual, and they have zero like heterosexual attraction. But for
Wow.
others, it's like 50-50. I was one of these 50-50 people where, I was attracted to the trans women,
Uh-huh.
but I was also, attracted to regular women as well. And
Yeah.
I always dated, women, um, you know, and then, but it's this whole trans lesbian phenomenon, transbians, like,
Uh-huh.
like most of that phenomenon is driven by this gynoandromorphophilia phenomenon. They're attracted to.
Oh.
This is why they are, these trans lesbians. They're not attracted to men,
Yeah,
but
they're
they're attracted to
literally
to trans women,
wow.
and they want to be trans women. So two trans women together is like the ultimate thing. However, it usually never works, because like that AGP usually manifests in behavioral AGP, which is where you want to be sexually treated as a woman, which is the
Mm,
stereotypically the submissive role. So now you have two bottoms together in relationship, and it never works out.
yeah. Wow, that makes sense because I noticed the transbian phenomena, but I didn't realize that it specifically had to do with like trans women specifically only being attracted to that specific body type. I thought they identified just as lesbian, but also included trans women in that definition, since that's like the, the new definition or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like complicated. The people like there's a lot of nuance to like because like the thing about AGP is it comes in many shades and varieties,
Mm.
and people want to lump it all into like one thing, but it's actually a very complex, multifaceted phenomenon that so it's not as straightforward, and it's not as easy to. But when you sort of lump it all together into one thing, people just demonize it, which is what I think, like a lot of the gender critical people do without fully
Oh,
understanding it. For example,
yes.
you did a reaction video to that debate between Phil Illy and that like it was on the Benjamin Boys. It was like Rudy or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yep, I remember that one. I
And
got some heat from feminists for that. Like, I'm like, damn, you
yeah,
guys dive deep. Like, a slightly twisted female was all my comments saying I'm a pervert shielder, and I got some of that backlash. And I've talked to like several trans people, so I'm not out here trying to like fit in with the hyper gender criticals. I'm doing my own thing, but I've definitely felt that pushback already, just for talking about the dress incident, which I thought was fairly benign and way overblown. Like,
right. Well, this is sort of one of the interesting things politically, and going back to the question of like, okay, well, if 80% of trans women in the West are AGP, why didn't anyone talk about it? Like, why is it suppressed? Well, it's suppressed because if it was widely known that if you just are randomly run across a trans woman in the mall or whatever, like chances are, statistically speaking, they are AGP. And so there's this assumption that insofar as the erotic is that the causal origins of that phenomenon of like why they are dressed the way they are, why they're acting the way they are, why they are wanting to use the women's spaces. If there's this idea that the erotic element is at the root of that phenomenon, there's this idea that in the transactivist mind that's going to delegitimize their identities, and therefore sort of and the gender criticals are sort of saying like, yeah, that is the right response. We need to shame that. We
yeah.
need to sort of say that these are dangerous perverts, and that because here's the thing, like all the bad apples amongst trans women, like all the
They do
the
tend to
great,
fit that subtype.
yeah, all the bad apples in terms of the people who commit sex crimes and sex offenders, the ones who are in prison, the ones who go viral on Twitter or whatever in the media
Yeah.
for walking into the women's spa with a boner, and like
Yep, yep.
like all the creepy ones, like they're all
The
AGP.
Jessica and Eve,
Yeah, so all, but however, just because all the bad apples are AGP doesn't mean all AGPs are bad apples.
Exactly. Exactly. And I highly agree with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And just like most violent crime is like committed by men, doesn't mean most men are violent. However,
Exactly. Yeah.
but there's this principle in the juicy world about safeguarding, where it's like, well, even if like statistically speaking most AGPs are not a actual risk in terms of like committing some sexual deviant act, nevertheless we want to protect against those bad apples by putting in these protections, particularly in vulnerable spaces like single sex changing spaces or female prisons. So we need a sort of general categorical absolute rule as a safeguarding principle to like prevent the bad apples. Now you can question whether pragmatically that'll ever work because
Yeah.
like
Right.
we don't have like AGP scanners on like the bathroom stalls. So like how are you going to pragmatically enforce this other than through social ostracization and shaming, which AGPs are immune to that because they're
That
already
they like
like
that sometimes.
well,
That's part
it's
part of
not
the
just a
performance for some, is like
yeah. Well,
part of it is
even
the
then,
reactions. It is the pushing boundaries, the act of pushing a woman's boundary and showing like, hey, I can walk in here with my dick out and you bitches can't say shit. Like that could be like a fetish in
right?
its own right.
Yeah,
It's louder.
yeah.
Like,
the bad apples aren't going to be like, oh, there's a norm in society that I ought not to do this, so therefore I'm not going to do
I know,
it.
right? Yeah.
This is why I, strongly advocate for third spaces and gender neutral bathrooms, so stuff like
Mhm.
this. But there are some cases like the single sex changing spaces, like, yeah, like maybe we do need to put in these strong protections. However, there's always going to be cases where there
Mhm.
are some trans women who just pass really, really well,
Yeah, yeah.
and they're going to feel entitled to use those spaces. And doesn't matter what anyone says, they're going to feel entitled to use those spaces. And there's really not much you can do about it,
Mhm.
because when you blend in, by definition, you don't cause social problems.
Yeah,
And a lot, and,
exactly.
and a lot of the trans women who pass really, 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 really well, they sort of are not interested in drawing attention to themselves.
Exact
It's like,
That's, like, it was most
um,
well, I mean, I've met, like there's, like, different kinds of trans people, but I've met, like, trans people, especially ones I met, like, earlier in my life, like, outside of activism, who they transitioned, they passed fairly well, and that's all they want to do with trans as a culture or even to being perceived, they live stealth and, it just doesn't come up and it's normal, and then there's the other type that it's, their whole identity, they become, once they start transitioning, it becomes their sole focus in life. I don't know, it's like goes two opposite ways. But with the, like,
yeah,
the spaces thing, the only thing I would draw, like where I'm at now, and this is subject to change because 'cause I'm still really kind of ironing out where I believe about a lot of these things, that's like, also there's just so much information that's not available, unfortunately, to understand, this cultural phenomenon, the social phenomenon, the individual phenomenon. Like, there's just so many different levels to analyze it from that are interesting, like, it's almost overwhelming to think about. But I've kinda settled on right now, I don't care that much about dressing rooms. Dressing rooms maybe a little more so than, like, bathrooms. Bathrooms, I really don't care at all. Changing rooms, I don't care at all really about changing in front of a trans woman, period, as long as they are not someone who's there for bad motives, but that's always a possibility wherever you go. So don't really care about that. But once you start getting to high level sporting competitions where your body matters, or when you get to jails where your fucking body matters, it matters that women can get pregnant. It matters that men have a physiology that can really do a substantial amount of harm to women, which is why we have these separate spaces. So that's where I am right now. And that's not good enough for either party, I noticed. That doesn't do me any favors with the trans community or the gender critical community. So I'm
yeah, I'm
whatever.
right there with you.
I am whatever. I'm just like, okay, well, this is the whole thing. I'm not trying to just appease a box. That's the whole fucking point, is I'm trying to just be nuanced, honest, and really have this conversation and try to get to some core knowledge so that we can then move forward and have maybe some strategy on how to best handle this situation and in our own way guide society to like more fruitful outcomes and more fruitful standards of care. Like, I don't know if you've been looking at the W path files.
Yes, very interesting.
Crazy. I might do a whole stream just going through the whole thing because it's just wild. But was there anything you saw that caught your eye with that you wanted to chat about?
Uh, my mind is blanking on specific details, but I mean, I think
Or just overall
in
the fact that like that this organization that is setting the standard of care in these hospitals, they go by, you could set a standard of care that said like stick a carrot in this person's ear. If that is the standard of care that is set forward, the nurses will do it, the doctors will do it. Like, but the fact that they're getting this info from WPATH, which is, been exposed as being corrupt, being fraudulent, not having this strong scientific backing that is always referred to. I can't
yeah.
find it. I'm looking for it and I would
Well,
love to find it, but I can't. I would love to have the socially popular view. So
yeah.
if
Okay.
anything can guide
So
me back that way, great. But like, you know.
I do recall something that stood out to me. So there's one example where a doctor is talking about sort of the problem of giving of getting informed consent from a 12-year-old in regards to giving a medical intervention that is going to permanently sterilize them, because they're like, it doesn't matter if they're cis or trans. Say like, hey, do you want kids? A 12-year-old is gonna be like, oh, babies, those are gross. Like, like
Even
like
I
they
didn't want kids
like
until I was like 29. It changed for me. I always
right,
said I
yeah,
absolutely do not. I actively did not want kids. I was like, never, not me, never. Then I hit 29, and like the biological clock, I guess, is real, because all of a sudden I starts like, oh, babies are cute, and now I full blown want kids, and it's like,
right,
and
yeah.
no child. It's hard for even an adult to make the decision. It is flat out wrong to put that decision on a child, objectively.
Right. And the fact that the doctor recognizes that as the impossibility of getting true informed consent in regards to the life-changing seriousness of these medical interventions. And also, it's not just like whether or not you have kids, but whether you want a functional sex life, you
Yeah.
know,
That's a
like
huge fucking
like
deal. Life is
a
long. Life is
right,
you're gonna be on this fucking planet for 80 years. This little period of your life where you're 13 and want to be trans, maybe if you're like rapid onset gender disorder, whatever, and you're sterilizing yourself and, changing your body when, most likely in a lot of these cases, especially for the young women who do this, like they do often grow out of it. And we're seeing so many more people come up with regrets. It's it just seems so, especially now that I'm someone who wants kids, it just seems so incredibly wrong to, and also just sexual function in general, to take that away so that someone has to live their whole fucking life. Might not, maybe they'll fall in love with someone who wants kids. That's fucked. Like there's so many
right,
situations in their life that will ruin them. That is a huge fucking deal that is really difficult for someone to deal with and process. So the fact that these doctors, I saw the video you're talking about, and they're just explaining it like la di da, like, oh, this is something that happens. They're explaining full well that they know these patients are incapable of giving consent. So what is the charade that we're doing? Like, it just seems.
well, the logic behind it all is that this is medically necessary because
Mhm.
they have dysphoria, and if you don't treat the dysphoria, these kids are going to kill themselves. That's the narrative. So the medical necessity, it's not like, oh, if we don't give this surgery, the cancer is going to proliferate and it's going to kill them. That's what we normally think of by
Mhm.
medically necessary surgery. Or
Yeah.
you're going to restore function. Oh, you have a cataract in your eye. We're going to do surgery on the eye to restore function. Well, this isn't restoring function. It
Mhm.
is the prevention of suicide. But that
Mhm.
whole narrative in regards to suicide has been debunked pretty
Mhm.
thoroughly, in my opinion. So that notion of medical necessity is it's tenuous.
Mhm.
Now that's for children, because I think
Mhm.
because you're sort of you're because children can't give informed consent, we use parental consent in matters where it is life and death,
Mhm.
cancer and these serious medical things where
Yeah.
we can define the medical necessity in terms of typical physiological depredations of normal healthy function. Now, once we get past minors into adults where, you can give informed consent, I'm actually libertarian in
Mhm.
regards to transition, such that if you want to, you know, get breast implants that are like triple G's or whatever,
Mhm.
we allow that in our American
Mhm.
society.
Yeah.
You can get plastic surgery to turn yourself into a lizard.
Yeah,
Like
literally.
we have all this freedom in our
Yeah.
society to modify your body to make you happy. It's a constitutional right to the pursuit of life and liberty and happiness and all this stuff. So it's like I truly believe that once you get past an adult, as long as like you're not like literally psychotic,
Yeah, yeah.
and you like actually force them to you know like understand the consequences. But the problem is like, and here's another thing I don't think that's often appreciated enough by people who are against gender medicine is, particularly for trans feminine people,
Mhm.
estrogen is extremely easy to get on the black market. And so if
Mm.
you are suffering from gender dysphoria, like and there's all this gatekeeping, and if we put up all this gatekeeping in the medical system, they're just going to go in the black market and order their hormone pills and take it.
True.
It's a lot harder to get testosterone because it's a controlled substance, but estrogen,
Yeah.
easy peasy, huge black market. And
Wow.
so they're going to take those black market pills, but they're not going to be monitored by the medical. They're not going to get their blood test by the doctors. So
True. There should be a
it's a
harm reduction aspect to the conversation for sure.
right,
And
totally.
so I'm with you on like the libertarian view of like, yeah, I think generally, 18, that's what we've decided an adult is. And, that could be debated too with like how your brain develops. But, you know, for all laws, I think if you're allowed to get plastic surgery, whatever kind, you should be able to transition. That should all be on the table, I guess, when you're 18 and you are afforded those rights. And we cannot protect people from making mistakes, period. But we can have a better system than we do right now with the gatekeeping. And
Right.
it's just about finding that balance so that we are taking the valid interests of like people who identify as trans into consideration and not accidentally overly gatekeeping to the point where they do resort to something that's more harmful. So
Right.
there just needs to be a lot
Well,
of very serious, nuanced conversation that isn't happening, so that is really that's why we see the standards of care and everything just in the cultural conversation goes so haywire. Like,
yeah. Well, the whole gatekeeping question is interesting because the trans activists will say, well, gatekeeping doesn't do anything. It's just a charade. You just go through the motions, if you have a requirement to get a letter from a therapist, well, like the trans people are just going to rehearse what to say to the therapist. They're going to come up with a narrative. Then they're all talking on their communities online about like, okay,
mhm.
well, what do you have to say? Oh, I've felt like this since I was 5 years old.
Yeah.
Like you can't verify that. Like, how are you gonna like have the therapist go interview your family members and
Right.
neighbors when you were 5 years old? Like, no, you just like it. So the whole charade of gatekeeping, unless you want to implement the old school real life requirements, which I don't think we're going to go back to that world
Yeah.
anymore. Um, so yeah, I don't know. So in
Well,
that
but then you could
sense,
just do like the gatekeeping of before we start you on hormones, you have to do a year of therapy, or like before we start you on this, you have to do 2 years of therapy, or before you do like a bottom surgery, you need to have been in therapy for this long and show that you are capable. Something along those lines would make sense to me and maybe be beneficial. Like,
yeah, it's hard to know where to draw the line in terms of what's like appropriate
mhm,
gatekeeping versus like you know and yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's always going to be people who once they get it in their mind that they want it, they're going to make it
mhm,
happen no matter what.
true.
They're gonna but I think we're if we want to implement gatekeeping, it has to be at the financial level. The insurance
Mhm.
coverage is where like the money has to be the important factor, because if it's not medically necessary from the insurance company's perspective, you're going to have a lot fewer people getting these, interventions because it's
Mm,
expensive to get
true.
bottom surgery. And if your bottom surgery is not covered by, insurance, then like there's a lot fewer people are going to get it. So
But
the
then on the
that
flip side, you'll have more trans people doing sex work and maybe putting themselves in risky scenarios to come up with that money like they did in the past. Sorry to cut off your train of thought.
right. No, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think this is where one of those things where like, the answer is we need a better healthcare system.
Mhm.
However, that's
Yeah.
easier said than
Yeah.
easier said than done, because in
Mhm.
general, in the United States, the healthcare system is poor in all areas of medicine, not
True,
not
yeah.
not
That's a
not
bigger
just gender
conversation,
medicine.
yeah. So do you
Medical
think
error is one of the leading causes of death in the entire country.
I
Um,
believe it. I've had so many terrible experiences
so
in hospitals that I've been to over the years and just, you know, it's a nightmare. It's the system we have. I mean, it could be a lot worse. Like overall, I'm extremely privileged because even in America, I've never not had healthcare. Like in some countries where people, there's not even a hospital near them. So, I try to keep things in perspective when I'm complaining. But yeah, it's not an ideal situation in many ways. You see that manifest in the trans issue. So I wonder what can even really be done for like someone like me, except like I guess putting our voices in the conversation, because by doing that, that can what I hope and what I've seen already is you saw when the detransitioners started coming out, more came out after them. So what I'm hoping is like with like AGP, because I do think that is like a critical key here to like maybe de-escalating what's going on, is like more honesty injected into the conversation. And I know that's really hard, but I thought Phil Illy had like maybe an interesting like way of describing autogynephilia that makes it a little less fetishy, where he's talking about the romantic aspect, like it isn't all sexual. So maybe like if that's viewed more as a serious orientation in the way that like Phil Illy describes it, do you think that could make it more respectable, that people might be more comfortable identifying with that? And then that can help decipher who's really benefits from transitioning, or not, or I don't know. What do you think of that?
I'm skeptical that the masses of trans women are going to openly admit that the erotic is at the causal origins
Mm,
of their thing. Because with the whole romantic thing, like there's usually a trajectory. It sort of starts off fetishistic. They
yeah.
explore their gender identity through the realm of kink and sex and fetish, and it's sort of like it's very common. You start off with like you watch some sissy porn, maybe you cross dress, and you experience like euphoria boners, and you get a thrill. You put on the like women's clothing. You get an erection. That's kind of like your first clue into the fact like, oh wow, I have some gender issues I need to
Yeah.
explore. And then you go on Reddit, you type in like, is it just a fetish? And you read all these
Mhm,
different stories, and then they get flooded with all these articles and essays and things like the Gender Dysphoria Bible and all these essays, and they sort of like get told like, oh, it's not just a fetish.
mhm,
It's just that your gender identity was repressed, and the only
mm,
means through which you explored your repressed gender identity, the sex was the safest outlet to do so, because transition is stigmatized, and so sexuality is like less stigmatized. So it's like like Freudian dynamics, like it's going to go to the path of least resistance, and so the sexuality is the
mm,
path of least resistance, so how it gets explored. But once you accept yourself as trans and the fetishistic aspect goes away, that's sort of like the sanitized narrative in regards
mm,
to how AGPs deal with it. And it's honestly, it makes sense why they'd go with that narrative, because you know you like don't want to be at work and your colleagues like thinking you're a pervert, like like
yeah,
and this is why the gender identity narrative is so common, because it kind of ties into like it's like a socially acceptable narrative. Like the reason I am the way I am is because I have this innate gender identity that is part of my core essence. Just like my race, my eye color, my personality,
mhm,
my like human rights. I have this innate gender identity as part of my core essence, and it has to be on one of these protected discriminatory lists, just like sex, national
mhm,
origin, ethnicity, age, all these things. Like it's like a core part of you, and that's like the ultimate explanation. It's immutable and all these different things, and that's a much more palatable explanation. And then you get like, oh well, it's genetic, I have a brain thing, it's like, and that it's the born way this narrative is much more palatable to the public, and so
yeah,
it's a better narrative to sell. And it also allows, and it also ties into AGP itself, because AGP is a, you fall in love with the idealized version of yourself as a woman. Well, if you understand yourself to have a male heterosexuality that's inverted, which is what the theory is,
yeah,
it sort of conflicts with the AGP idealization of oneself as a woman, because AGP wants nothing more than to fully be validated in that ideal of oneself as a woman, which stands in conflict with understanding yourself to have inverted male heterosexuality. So this is why AGPs don't like the idea of AGP, because it
mm,
conflicts with the very psychological manifestation built into the mechanism of AGP.
Ah. So I'm curious with so if you don't see AGP becoming like more accepted, I mean, I could see it becoming like more accepted from the like place of non-acceptance that it's at. I could see that happening with more people destigmatizing it. But yeah, I suppose you're right that it's unlikely it'll pick up traction and be find its way into the trans movement as like a common justification or reason. Because I wonder even if and this ties into like two kind of questions I had for you. I'll start with this maybe simpler one, maybe not, but okay. For someone who is an autogynephile and they know it, is it ever or not ever, I don't want to make this too broad, but do you see scenarios where it's not harmful for an autogynephile to just like pursue that interest, to do the surgeries, like, or do you always view that as kind of just going down a path that's not going to bring happiness the same way like going down the path of like using a drug you really like? Do you view it as like diminishing returns and ultimately probably not a good path to go down?
I mean, I think it depends on the severity of AGP, because AGP, it manifests in severity of intensity. So for some people, it's incredibly intense. It causes extreme psychological dysfunction such that they are psychologically, socially crippled
Mm,
by AGP. It is truly an affliction that they suffer from. And so this is why Ray Blanchard, when he was doing his original, like he was a clinician first and foremost. He was not a researcher. He was a
mhm,
clinician. He published research, but first and foremost, he was interested in helping his patients. And he thought, as along with like Michael Bailey and some of these other researchers, that when it is a severe enough intensity of AGP, that transition is an appropriate
mhm,
clinical intervention to relieve that psychosocial dysfunction.
mhm.
And I generally think that is true.
Okay.
Now, like there's for people who have less intensity,
Mm,
less like dysfunction, I do think that there are plenty of AGP males out there who, if they read Phil Illy's book, if they learned about AGP, if they truly understood themselves, because it's hard
mm.
to give informed consent to treat a thing, like treat a condition, and you don't really understand the nature of that condition.
True, true.
So I think if they understand themselves and they learned to accept themselves as males and realize that, hey, it is possible to be a femboy. You don't have to, you know, do all this stuff in order to be a femboy or cross dress or whatever, and blah blah. And then maybe that they might learn to live with it. However, I don't know if you do. Do you know who Finster is? Like that femboy who's like a big.
That sounds familiar. I don't know if I'm super familiar though.
He's like this huge Twitch streamer femboy, and like his big shtick for the longest time was like, like I'm a guy, but I look like a girl, and he's
I
like,
think yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep, I think I know who
um,
you're talking about. Yeah.
well, he started dating a trans woman, trans people. He started getting involved in the trans community. I mean, I thought classic case of AGP, and
Mhm.
also, but long story short, he recently came out with a video like last week saying, "Oh, actually, I've been on HRT for like, 6 months, and now
No
I'm
way.
like, I'm
They're fully on
transitioning, and now
board.
I'm gender fluid." So there's sort of this classic thing of like, oh, the trans community is like transing away the butch lesbians. They're all like,
Mm,
trans men. Well, I think there's a similar phenomenon with femboys.
absolutely. I could see that for sure.
Because within AGP, now I want to bracket this. I'm just speculating about Fenster's
Sure.
psychology, so I could be totally off. Maybe, but to me, classic AGP. But the thing about AGP is the longer you indulge in it, the longer you sort of engage with it, um, you sort of like, you want to take it to the next level.
Mm.
And so, you know, like you want to always feminize more, a little bit more feminization. You just
Mhm.
want to feminize more and more and more and more. And so HRT is part of that. And also within sissy culture, within femboy culture, HRT itself, transition itself, becomes part of the fetish. The
Mm.
HRT, the transition process is fetishized.
Just like that is it. The process is it. Like
Yeah,
that that's what
yeah.
they're like getting off on is they're like, yeah,
H-
yeah.
HRT is seen as a form of of emasculating yourself, which fits into
The
the sissification. The ultimate sissification step is HRT. So
oh,
like it's part of the fetish.
yeah. And
And
that's with
because
even with the homosexual
no,
subtype too, or it's only AGP?
this is only AGP.
Okay.
The like homosexual type is a totally different ball game.
Just yeah, it's very
Their motivations are totally different.
mhm.
Um, so, but yeah, I mean that's sort of my hope is like, and like all this stuff about gatekeeping and all this stuff. Like I think we're not going to see changes unless you're at the cultural level. The
Mm,
cultural conversation needs to change such that we sort of get males to like being male, to
mm,
appreciate, you know, it's not bad to be a man, it's not bad to be male. But a lot of
mhm,
that comes from like this sort of like you know, this internalized hatred of masculinity that like a lot of men on
mm.
the left of center is
Yes.
progressive, the like sensitive, soft, I'm not like other
Mhm.
men. You know, I'm not one of these. I don't get along with macho men. I don't get along with blue collar men. I'm
There's
like
so much
intellectual.
hatred,
Like I
yeah.
like read books. Like
Well,
it's
because they
very
got so much hatred for being that way that I think it creates, like, a mutual animosity too, that but a lot
right,
of it, I'll have to take some credit as, like, a feminist for, really pushing the toxic masculinity thing and not offering a good alternative, not offering a valid, respectable cultural place for men to be and, an ideal of masculinity, and a lot of masculine things that are positive have been reviewed as negative, and a lot of things about femininity that are positive are viewed as negative, and that complementary nature of men and women has been just torn apart, and I think that that feeds into a million other fucking issues that we're having as a society, but
right,
it is really unfortunate, and I do see that with men, especially on the left, that they hate other men, and the conversation for a lot of my social groups, it was very just like, "Men are trash," like, that was just the vibe for even when men are
yeah,
there, and, like, all the relationships, the women tended to be, like, more domineering, and the men took a more, like, passive role, and I don't know, it's very
right. I
interesting.
mean, how many queer spaces or leftist events are like everybody but cis men?
Yeah, I know, literally. Or, like,
Like,
white men like, if you're white and cis, I can that's why I think there is,
right.
like, another perverse incentive that we could throw in the mix for transitioning, which is the
Yes,
the
totally,
social
totally.
aspect, like, I noticed a lot in the music scene, and this is kind of fucked up to even say, whatever. I kind of have thought, because 'cause I've noticed a huge amount of, males who I had performed musically with, like, over the years, ended up transitioning, but in the music scene, it became like I would play in all-girl bands or bands of trans people, and we get a lot of attention just for that, So it's and you became cooler. You are the underdog fighting the oppressor. No one wants to be you wanna have the hero's journey. You wanna be the oppressed one who overcomes, like, it's
Right.
cooler. It's you could sell that, like, the songs are cool. You have reason to be pissed off and, like, punk as fuck, like, and then
Yeah.
you're elevated, and I saw maybe some bands get more elevated, and I noticed another guy transition, another guy, and I'm like, it just started being, like, so much that, like, I have questions to understand what that got me partially interested in, like, the whole phenomenology of it, but, like, I do
Right.
wonder what weird incentive there is there that it's almost cool and socially there's some
So
points to it.
my theory is that it's about status. So
Mm,
there's this interesting book I read by this guy. I think his name is Will. Will Star maybe, but it's called The Status Game.
Uh-huh.
And he talks about how, from an evolutionary perspective, as a social species, like status is very important to social species. You sort of, and historically, there's sort of like different status games that people play. So you can play, like, if you're a man, you can play a physical dominance game. Who's biggest, strongest? That's a way to get status. Is you're the alpha, you're the big, strong, dominant. You gain physical status.
Yeah.
Another, if you're and like start wars, you gain physical status.
Yeah.
Another way to play status games is like your Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musk of the world. They're not physically dominant, but
Mhm.
they won the success game in the
Mm.
capitalist society. So they a lot of money, a lot of success, business success, pragmatic success. So that's one way to gain status. Another way to gain status is what's called a moral status or virtue status. So you get status and virtue of being more virtuous, more moral. And
Yeah.
so this
Mhm.
explains a lot of the call out cancel culture Twitter mobs of the left, this whole sort of wokeism, such that you can get status by being more moral, being more virtuous than anyone else. This is,
Mhm.
so you sort of like call out people, you sort of like critique people, you sort of like know more theory, more,
Mhm.
you're the most hardcore Marxist in the entire,
Yep.
like room.
Yep.
That's how you're going to get your status. And I think, if
Uh,
you are a cis straight white male,
uh-huh.
you're sort of, and you're not winning the physical dominance game, you're not winning the success game, you're in your mom's basement or whatever, you're sort of like an incel type.
Mhm.
There's this whole idea of like transmaxxing, which is kind of like a joke, but I think it's true in many
I
respects.
I'm a little I also
That's
incel culture is one of the things I,
uh,
like, lurk on, so I'm familiar with, like, yeah,
yeah.
the transmaxing. I don't
So
know, I know it's a meme, but, like,
I think
I
it's
don't know.
kind of true, and it
I
might
think
not be
it
like
yeah.
explicitly identified, but so if you're one of these cis straight white males who doesn't not winning the physical dominance game, you're not super attractive, you're don't have the status, don't have a great job, but like, you know, but you have all this white privilege, cis privilege, straight
Mm,
privilege, like, how can you gain a little bit more status?
right.
Identify as non-binary. Now you're part of the marginalized group. Now you can put like a feather in your marginalized identity cap,
Yep.
and so you are now part of the. Now you're not an oppressor. You're oppressed.
Mhm.
So you can tap into this liberation movement. Get be an activist, and so I think that's one of these status games we play, and the non-binary and the trans, for a lot of these men who don't have severe body dysmorphia, severe gender dysphoria, they're
Mhm.
tempted into this identity because it's a way to opt out of being at the top of the oppression Olympics hierarchy.
That's fascinating to me, like, endlessly, and also, like, on what level are they even aware that, like, that's in motivation? It could be so deep and, like, subconscious and so primal and so, like, just evolutionary drive that's just, like, manifesting so bizarrely in society, and depending on the subculture you're trying to gain status in, it sounds insane to people who aren't of these very specific bubbles. Like, I live in a very blue area, very far left crowd. Like, that is very much my social surroundings. That isn't for everyone. So for some people to hear that someone would claim these identities for status sounds crazy, but like if
Well,
those
I don't think it's
in those
just
communities
status,
to get
because
status, it's a
the
part of
the
it.
other thing is, if you are a cis white straight male of average looks, intelligence, and success, or below average, whatever, you might have zero success on Tinder. You
Mm,
might swipe 1,000 times and get one match, and then you get rejected and you never go on a date. So you might not be successful in the dating market. Well, at least if you're trans, there's a whole group of chasers and fetishists who,
mhm.
like,
Yeah, that's true. And then
it's
there's
like,
also a lot of like liberal women. Like I've been open to dating trans women. I've been attracted to like I'm
yeah,
bisexual.
they're considered safer than cis men.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like that I could very plausibly seeing that transition could open you up to, if you have 0 opportunities by transitioning, it does open you up to not great opportunity, but yeah, you get the very liberal woke woman, you get the chasers, like, so you are stepping up in some way for status, for sexual interaction, like that. I do see that being a very
Yeah.
plausible motivation for
And
sure.
it's not just like you get like more potential dating success, is that as a cis white straight man, there's a certain social script in terms of dating such that you are supposed to be the pursuer,
Mm,
whereas like women aren't interested, like you're never the person who receives attention sexually.
yeah, yeah,
So and a lot of men who are submissive, their sexual fantasy is to be the receiver of attention,
yes,
to be receptive sexually. And as men, it's unless you find a femdom or something, like,
mhm,
you're never gonna scratch that itch to be the receiver of attention,
mhm,
to be this quote unquote like receptacle or whatever.
mhm,
Whereas like when you're trans, like now you can be, you you can scratch that itch sexually. So
yeah,
I think there's multiple. I don't think it's
wow,
purely the saddest thing. I don't think it's purely sexual. It's a lot of these mixed motivations, but there's definitely like this sort of like incel to trans pipeline, for sure.
wow, that is fascinating. I like just everything about just the way, like, my ultimate deep fascination is just in like human behavior and cultures as a whole and how they develop and have sprung up, and the very interestingly bizarre ways in which these desires manifest in a modern society. It's so crazy and interesting to me, and I'm just so happy I have the internet so that I can just read about these things and find random people like you to talk to. You are such a great resource because you are brilliant and articulate and insightful and forthcoming. So that's like the important like quad quadrant of qualities to have, to really, I think, make change and inspire people and get like your general message across. And I do think that helps people because even at a minimum, and the reason why I divulge maybe a lot of personal information about myself is for that purpose of maybe helping someone else feel less alone or have maybe some insight about my experience, how I got through my own struggles that they can apply to their lives. So I do think it's like it's hugely important what you're doing. But we
Yeah,
are,
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've had a lot of like AGP men reach out to me and say that they really like resonate with my story. Both people who are AGP and transition trans women, and also
yeah.
AGPs who haven't transitioned, and also AGPs who are detransitioned. So there's a whole spectrum of
Mhm.
people who I think are like hungry for honesty in
Yes.
this conversation,
Yes.
because the trans activists, cancel culture mob, they want to only have the sanitized narrative that you
Mhm.
see on like ABC News Hour or whatever, where
Yep.
it's like this really nice story, it's all sanitized, and and yeah, like it's yeah, I think people are just like tired of having to walk on eggshells around trans people, like
And I think
you
trans
know
people are tired of that, like, I have a lot of trans friends who, like, they agree with my views, like, we talk just as we are talking right now privately, which is the issue, which is why I wanna, like, encourage some of these conversations to be more public so that people can see it and realize it's happening, maybe converse amongst, their own little groups and, see because yeah, I do have a similar intuition and perception that broadly speaking, there a lot more people are interested in like, yeah, hearing more conversations like this, hearing what you have to say about the topic and hearing something real. Because I think people do kind of realize like something's not fully adding up with the conversation. They can't put their finger on what it is. So it's good to have like just another video on YouTube besides the one that's like, here's my transition journey and why it's great. It's like,
Yeah.
I support those videos being there, but alongside them, there should be those videos of people who had very different experiences. That's the whole point,
Yeah.
is having more voices out there to get a more accurate picture of what's going on.
Right. And I think people are tired of the sort of postmodern Judith Butler radical social constructivist epistemology that sort of denies the reality of sex differences. I
Mhm.
think, and this is why when I first started my YouTube channel and I first started critiquing gender ideology, the topic I did the most videos on was the sports topic, because I
Ah, yeah.
think among like liberals and progressives, there's sort of like NPR Democrats, your kind of
Mhm.
typical, progressives, read the New York Times, they donate to NPR, they're kind of they're pro trans because they're told they're supposed to be pro trans.
Yeah, yeah.
Because the Democratic Party is pro trans, because AOC is pro trans, everyone's pro trans, and you're not supposed to question it. Among that group, I think that the sports topic is the
Mm.
best angle to sort of crack their worldview
Mhm.
open and interject some objective reality, because
Mm.
it is just an obvious intuitive fact that you don't have to be a PhD researcher, you don't have to go like write a dissertation on this
Mhm.
topic. You could just clearly perceive in regards to sports that there is sexual dimorphism,
Yep.
and that, let's say, LeBron James, tomorrow he does a press conference and he's like, guys, I got to tell you, I've been suffering from gender dysphoria my whole life. I've known I'm a woman since I was 5 years old. I just repressed it my
Yeah.
entire life. Are we gonna say it's fair to like for LeBron James to compete in the WNBA? I don't care how many hormones he takes.
Mhm.
That's not gonna reverse the obvious sexual dimorphism of LeBron James. You say like, oh, well, that would never happen. Why not? Because the gender
Yeah.
activists want to say that there's no correlation between your body type. If you're 6'4", 300 pounds, you can be just as much as a real woman as like the twink, whoever, who's
Mhm.
like 5'5" and 110 pounds. So there's no correlation between your physiology and your gender identity. They're supposed to say like, anybody could be a woman, anybody could be a man. It's like, it's pure subjective identity essence. You're pure in your
Yeah.
gender soul. So with the sports issue, I feel like people had the clearest intuitive sense that something is wrong here, and saying that like LeBron James,
Mhm. Could go on swimming too. I mean, I think
that it'd be totally fair for
yeah.
LeBron James if he was on hormones for 1 year, that it'd be totally fair for him to compete. Like, oh, well, women come in all shapes and sizes. So LeBron James is no, that's not, like, people know this. Like,
I mean, for me, that was like probably the issue that made me realize, like, I had like some thoughts and like, maybe like something isn't feeling quite right, but it was really a sports issue where I couldn't make myself like lie about it. I would be objectively lying about my beliefs to say that I think what I'm watching when Leah Thomas is on the swim team, to say that I think that looks fair, or that is fair, or that makes sense. Like it defies the whole point of having a female category, because it's based on our different biology. It just makes no sense to change the ultimate classification of women to be one based on like an identity versus our physiology, which is just the fact that it's just so bizarre having to like explain such rudimentary concepts that it's almost like it's
and
almost
then you
maddening.
get
It's like
and you get gaslit into
you
thinking
do, yeah.
your those assumptions that you
Mhm.
have, those intuitions that you have, that there's this difference between males and females, that like, oh, those assumptions and intuitions, those are due from internalized transphobia. It's
That's what I
because of
believed for like
it's
a long
because of
time. So
yeah,
sorry, I'm just plugging myself in real quick.
it's because of systemic transphobia in society. And if only society was less transphobic, then we'd all just wake up and realize that like there's no such thing as male and female.
Right? Like
And
it doesn't.
and they And then they try and appropriate the intersex movement, which is another
Mm.
annoying thing. That's like, oh well, it's all a spectrum anyway. Like, there's no such difference. Like,
I've
it's
had
just
these
total,
arguments so many times, like on Twitter, and the way I've boiled down, I stopped arguing about chromosomes. I stopped arguing about pretty much everything except the gametes, because that's where they can't, like, that's the most obvious boiling it. Like, if you boil down sex to one singular thing, it is that the male of all species. And also, it's like, okay, are we going to change our classification for all species? Because that's for male and female. That's for many animals, and like we are animals, and the female of the animal species produces the egg, and the male of the animal species produces the sperm. And there's obviously variation. There are genetic anomalies, there are diseases, there is malfunction. But if you are born with the body plan that is designed to produce ova and carry a baby, even if that malfunctions, you are still female. That is still your body plan, and that body plan will influence how you interact with the world for your whole life. Same goes if you're male. You have very different experiences, and that's valid, important. And there's just really no good argument, except that for 1% of the population hurting their feelings less about what team they play on versus abolishing women as a category. It's like,
yeah. Well, this is where they employ these like philosophical mental gymnastics, because they'll say like, oh, well, there are these like rare cases where people are born with like both gametes. They have both testicles and ovaries. So therefore, there's no such thing as the difference between males and females. And it's like,
even if
this
that
is one of
existed,
those.
which is like such an extreme anomaly that it almost just shows they lost their ground there by the fact that they're reaching at extreme genetic anomalies to justify, even if that existed, even if that was 2% of the population, we still have to make categories in order to fucking function as a society. Categories can only exist via exclusion. So using all this fucking language about being excluded, that's what a category is, and it's nothing
Right.
personal, but we have to, in order to have certain institutions and to be treated by doctor, like there's so many situations where sex is relevant, and not in most, but in those very specific situations, like doctors, sports, blah blah blah. But anyway, what you're saying about the sports, I fully agree, and like in some ways, I almost feel like too fixated on the issue, but I just think it is such a good jumping off
Well,
point and entry
this
point to
is
understanding.
right. This is another thing they'll say is like, I heard someone say on Twitter the other day that was like, there are more trans bills or quote unquote anti-trans sports bills than there are actual trans sports players in these particular. So it's like, oh, this is a nothing burger. There's like so few
And
trans
it's a nothing
people.
burger,
It's like doesn't matter. This only affects a few people. No
So then let
big
us pass the
deal,
bill. Then what's the big deal if it's a
right?
nothing burger? Like if it's so
um,
few, why is this? Like obviously
right.
it's an important issue. We're both going head to head on it. Like,
Right.
get
And
real,
and the
dude.
reason why I talk about it is not because like I'm like some super fan of women's sports. I don't watch women's sports. I mean, I also don't watch men's sports either. So it's
Yeah.
but so it's not because I'm like particularly passionate about like women's sports. It's because I think it illustrates a
Mm.
general philosophical principle in regards to what has gone wrong in our sort of like liberal culture, such that we've lost our ability to reference reality with basic, clear language that is understood by the populace. Because the purpose of language,
Mhm.
like, is to have shared meaning amongst a
Mhm.
population of speakers.
See, this is how
And
rudimentary we have to get in this conversation.
right,
It's like,
right. And
but you
the
have
trans
to. You have
act
to,
yeah,
because
and the
people
trans
aren't
activists,
processing it,
yeah.
and it does need to be broken down. So sorry, continue.
And the trans activists, they want to sort of say that up is down, left is right, male is female, man is woman, and if you say different, you're a hateful bigot who deserves to be fired from your job.
Mhm.
Which is the other thing I'm really passionate about is like cancel culture, because
Mm.
I used to never really care much about free speech as like an issue, but now it's one of my big like things I'm really passionate about, because
It's fundamental to
like
our society succeeding, and to ugh, it's so fundamental, like, and so important the fact that any movement would just be like, dude, that's not that important. It is. It's so fundamental.
Right. And the fact that they're trying to make it, like, used to be that the left would be like, oh, free speech is like, that's something the like only the right cares about. That's like a
Yeah.
fascist issue, like, because like and they use this thing like the paradox of like tolerance, where they say like, oh well, like if we tolerate Nazis walking around with free speech, it's going to lead to like the destruction of society. So in order to protect our liberal democracy, we actually have to like restrict free speech, and that's like better for society if we restrict free speech. And they use these examples, saying fire in a crowded theater, so we have to, but it's like,
well, yeah, there's obviously there are going to be
yeah,
common sense, limits to that, but it is very fundamental and fucking important to be able to organize and be able to publicly state your opinions. Like, even if they are reprehensible, the answer is to counter protest that, and
yeah,
show that your ideas are better. And that's been done time and time again in society, so that
yeah,
we know that there is a mechanism to deal with ideas we don't like. And the mechanism that we've seen not work is suppression. We've seen suppression of free speech really not work many times. So yeah, that does not seem to be the route to go.
yeah, totally. And I used to hate Jordan Peterson when I was like a trans activist and left, because he got famous for being a transphobe against non-binary people.
Yeah.
But now that I've sort of like got into all this kind of gender critical free speech stuff, I sort of like recognize that regardless of whether your thoughts on him in general as like a public intellectual and like thinker, yeah, I mean, he's not, he's not perfect by any means.
I'm a Jordan
Um,
Peterson apologist, so this is a
yeah.
safe space to talk
Yeah,
about.
but I realized that once I thought about it, like the thing he got famous for in terms of like it's not that he wanted to like cause psychological distress to these
Mhm.
non-binary people by like misgendering or whatever. It's just like he realized that the Canadian law was compelling
Mm.
speech. They're
Mhm.
saying you must utter these words from your mouth, otherwise
Mhm.
it's a crime.
That is
And
different, yeah.
he just, and that's different than and that's just going too far. And like, and he just stood his ground and said like, no, that's going too far. Liberal societies, you can't compel
Mhm.
you can't say that you must say these words or else you're going to jail or you're going to be fined, you're going
Yeah,
to lose your job, like
very dangerous path to go
um
down with many, like, crazy consequences and ramifications from, like.
right. So yeah, I mean, I'm also, I'm much more amenable and a fan of like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I've watched, like, I used to watch his videos to, like, look for thought crimes to, like, call him out for, like, literally, if you look at my Facebook from, like, 2016, I'm just posting all about how much I hate Jordan Peterson this, Jordan Peterson that, blah, blah, blah. One of my exes went back and looked through it because he was a huge Jordan Peterson fan. So he's, like, looking through all my old Facebook and, like, sent me the screenshots, and I was, like, so embarrassed because I had my own little feminist awakening, like, in my 20s, like, where it's like, "Whoa, oppression," like, and I just was, like, like, I thought I was, like, seeing things as they truly were, and, like, it was so critical to, like, calling out oppression wherever you see it all the time, like, and Jordan Peterson is, like, like, he, for whatever reason, now that I'm so much more familiar with his work and him as a person in this broader way, it seems comical the way that he's been maligned and this character he was turned into, because at worst, maybe he says stuff in a way that could be misinterpreted, and at worst, maybe he's, a little older and doesn't maybe understand every little nuance of trans ideology. But ultimately, like, yeah, I don't think he was wrong in his handling of that. I think that's valid to stand on, and it was admirable. And he got a huge amount of backlash. He did get a huge career out of it, but that was an unforeseen consequence. I'm not cynical enough to think that that was like his goal. Like, that could have
right.
never been predicted. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think he was genuine. He was like just some random professor. He was like a
yeah,
nobody. He was like a nobody, but
literally.
he like stood his ground on a principled matter of free
Mm.
speech. It wasn't actually about transphobia,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, and
that's
I
the
generally
thing.
I just do not believe in my heart. And this is why I speak about stuff and I'm just like, I'm just gonna honestly describe my perception with the caveat that I could be wrong, but like in my heart of hearts and my perception of him as a person, I no part of me thinks that he's someone who just started out because he was like, "Ooh, I don't like this trans stuff, so I'm gonna publicly call it this bill because I just don't like that it advances trans rights because I just find them icky." Like, that just doesn't seem very plausible to me. Like, as
Right.
but that's the general
But
perception of him is that
yeah,
he's
but
just
he got
a
labeled
bigot.
as a transphobe.
Mhm.
And that becomes the ultimate
Mm.
thought terminating cliche.
Yes.
It's like, you just
Really,
like,
on so many levels,
you
internally,
know,
externally.
yeah. And it's like, oh, I don't have to think about his argument. I don't have to engage with what he's saying
Mhm.
because I've been told by the activists that he's a transphobe. Therefore, I can dismiss every single thing he says
And
and
that's how
every
they've gotten
single
so
word.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I felt myself in a bubble where I was insulated from ideas that challenged my worldview. It's like such a perfect little insulation of like yeah, like you're saying, the thought, the eliminating cliche of like me thinking that any thought I had, I would just be like, that's internalized transphobia. Like that must be wrong. That person must be evil. So I would just like reject all of these things, and I was limiting myself from really honestly intellectually engaging with the issue. And I was limiting myself and the resources that I looked at and the people I listened to and the conversations I'd be willing to have. And like once that door opened a little bit, I realized like, now looking back at a lot of my views, how, rigid and in like impenetrable my ideology was to, to criticism,
Yeah. And I remember like, when I first started like detransitioning and like starting to question like the trans ideology, I was like scared to like even follow certain people on
Mm,
social media. It's like,
yes,
oh,
yeah,
are people gonna look at who I'm following on social
yeah,
media and like get me fired from my job? You know how
yeah.
crazy that like that's like
It is
communist China
possible.
type levels of like thought control and thought crime.
I actually know
It's
someone
like,
who that happened to, like, for following,
yeah, yeah.
I don't wanna out their story.
I
Okay,
saw
yeah.
that interview you
So you
did.
know what, yeah,
Yeah,
that fucking happens, like, that
yeah. It's crazy, crazy.
so that yeah, that's another reason why I feel compelled to, like, talk about this issue is there's just so many different ways that it's just going haywire, and it's,
Yeah.
I
However, I do think that because the conversation between left and right and the culture is so polarized that once you start questioning this gender ideology stuff, like you start realizing that it's like connected to all these other political
mm,
threads. So once you start pulling the thread, like a lot
mhm,
of stuff unravels in
mhm,
it, and then it's
yes,
like the only people talking about it are the conservatives,
mhm,
and so I think it's very easy. There's like a skepticism about the trans to alt-right conservative pipeline.
mm,
And I'm not even going to say it's like wrong to be a conservative because,
mhm,
I think, conserving
mhm,
traditions and ancient value systems
mhm.
is a good thing, generally speaking. So I don't want to like universally say like, oh, if you're a conservative, you're like an evil, terrible bigot, and
Yeah,
like,
I'm
and
much more, like,
like,
receptive, and the way I've kind of view it now is that, like, there's 2 ways of organizing society, and there's, like, conservative versus, like, a liberal way, which is also kind of the feminine versus masculine, and just in that same way that feminine and masculine can complement each other perfectly, or that friction between those 2 desires is actually what can create a better outcome that I think
right.
in America, that friction between Republicans and Democrats and liberals, that, like, in between ground that you can get to is probably the one that serves the most people, I would think.
Yeah, but I think you can go too far.
Mm,
I think it's very easy to get into extremes
yes.
in your ideology.
Mhm,
And like it's just, yeah, so and I think that's just like a natural tendency of the human mind is to I mean, like we all like our black and white answers. They're
Mhm.
just easier. They feel better,
Exactly.
you know, like it's just so much easier to have a totalizing system that gives you all the answers. You don't have to think
Mhm.
anymore. You have the answers to everything. You just like follow your guru
Yeah.
on your side. You have your side with the other
Yeah.
side. Everyone comes the enemies, and like you stop thinking, and
Mhm.
you know, you know. So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, it's been really interesting because you know my wife can attest to this. I've been since I detransitioned, I've gone through like a lot of ideological worldview
Mm.
reconfiguration. Like I've been like whiplash in terms of changing my beliefs. You know, I have like the whole
Same. I've been
I
having
had the whole Christianity thing going on.
yeah.
I like briefly flirted with like conservative, like evangelical fundamentalism, and
Mhm.
when I discovered my Christianity, and in terms of
I
like
actually went through a Christian thing recently. I had, like, some big life events happen, and, I got clean from drugs, had that a very intense psychotic experience with that. Now that I'm on the other side of it, though, and have been, got back into researching my interests and things that I was interested in before the drugs and, getting back into that, and now with, like, a clear mind, it was, like, through the trans issue, I noticed a similar unraveling with other narratives in the media that I so truly believed, and it has been an absolute whiplash of, like, my views, like, all shifting and rearranging to the point where, like, I'm not doing a lot of debates or anything right now because I'm still shifting where I even am, and I, for a while too, was very, like I used to have an upside down cross tattooed on my arm. I was, like, very anti-Christian, but now I'm much more I kind of, got more open to
I lost
it, like,
you.
reading the Bible and the
You
way that I used to.
you should have broke up a little bit.
Oh, sorry, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Your like internet is like chopping up a little bit.
Dang it. Um, well, I don't know if you can
You,
hear me.
you're better now. You're better now. You're back to
Oh,
normal
okay.
now.
Well,
It was just like a very brief bit of choppiness.
I was just well, thank you for letting me know. But yeah, I was just saying about how I like since so many of my ideas have shifted, that's one thing. Like religion, I had wholeheartedly been very much against. Now I'm more warmed up to it. Like for a while, I was even like going to church and like exploring that more. I've kind of like peeled back a little bit because I'm just so confused about what to believe. Because intellectually, I can't really make myself believe in a God. But I also realized that I'm a person that maybe does have like some kind of spiritual need for something higher. So I'm in like an exploratory phase of like being more open to it. But I come from like a Christian background too, so that was like, you know, and I've looked into like
Yeah.
other religions. I'm definitely just in like a weird kind of
Yeah.
spot.
Well, the fastest growing religious demographic is the nuns, who
Oh,
are actually they're not usually total full-blown materialist atheists. They're usually spiritual but not religious.
oh, interesting.
And so I think a lot of people are naturally very spiritual, which is why
Mm,
like this sort of like paganism and
mm,
occultism and like Wicca and the New Age and all these
yeah.
different like sort of eclectic, like sort of like a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of
Mhm.
Hinduism, a little bit of paganism, a little bit of Christianity, and they kind of mix it all together. I think that's very appealing
Yeah.
because it kind of gets at this fundamental human desire for the spirituality. But I think a lot of us grew up in fundamentalist
Mm,
evangelical backgrounds such that what it means to be religious is it's very literalistic. It's about having certain beliefs. It's about like,
mhm,
do you have a intellectual belief in a god, and can you intellectually defend that? And it's like in the Bible becomes like inerrant, and it's all about like
mhm.
these precise theological intellectual. It's very like a very heady
Yeah, yeah,
in how it's
yeah.
oriented. But I think but there's another tradition that I think has been neglected in Christianity, which is the mystical and contemplative tradition within Christianity, which the purpose of the mystical and contemplative approach in Christianity is not to sort of have a belief about God, it's to experience God. It's to
Mm,
have that more unitive contemplative path, which is about wisdom, not
mhm.
about belief. I think
Mm.
so much of evangelicalism is about, do you have the right belief? Do you
Yeah.
have the right doctrine? And can you intellectually defend that doctrine? And they get into all these apologetics debates, and it's about like convincing people and about getting in, debates, and like, and that's why these denominations are split up a million
Mhm.
times, because it's like all these debates about doctrines and beliefs, where
Yeah.
I think the spiritual but not religious impulse
Mm.
sort of can really like stand to learn about these contemplative pathways.
Mhm.
And I think the reason why, at least for me personally, why the Christianity is more appealing than like, another system like Hinduism, and I
Mhm.
really appreciate, studying other religions like,
Mhm.
Hindu Vedanta, like the system called Vedanta, and like Hinduism is like
Uh-huh.
really philosophically beautiful. It's, it's like a really, I think it's true as far as it goes, but it's like
What's it called?
it's called Vedanta.
Vedanta. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that, put it simply, all is one, and that you are one with the ultimate reality, which is
Mhm.
beyond all comprehension. So,
Mhm.
and that's sort of the thing about the contemplative tradition, is that God is not meant to be like understood. Like God is beyond. We can't put God in words. We can't put the spiritual in words.
Mhm.
But I think with Christianity, like I like it because it matches my cultural heritage. I grew up with
Mhm.
it, so it's sort of like it's my home base culturally.
Yeah, yeah,
And
same.
also, it's very old, and I think this is why
Mm.
there's a lot of the conservatives. I think there's a strong appeal. This is why the Roman Catholic, these like, trad caths, like I think there's sort of appeal to that, because this is the conservative mindset. There's
Mm.
something about like old things that just
Mm.
like, like the human mind just really likes things that are old.
Well, that's so
Um,
it feels like larger than you just for that aspect too, because you're now connecting with like a ritual or like a doctrine that's been, read and observed and, created spiritual experiences for, billions of people for a long span of time. I can see that in itself kind of having like a meaningful quality to it. But I can kind of get down with like, more of like, and Jordan Peterson's kind of like this, like with his whole perception of like Christianity and God, where it's like it it is more fluid, it's more philosophical, it's not as fundamentalist, not as hardline. He doesn't even necessarily state if he believes in God, clearly, unless he's I do think he's changed maybe post some of his personal issues, but I can kind of get down with that because part of me wonders and is concerned if like there is like this evolved instinct for religion, and perhaps humans really like need that. Like true or not is aside from the point. It's an evolved thing across every culture across the world. It
yeah,
eh, and then you have these ones that have popped up and become ultra dominant for thousands of years. That it's because there is like, and what I appreciate about reading the Bible is like revisiting and reflecting on profound wisdom and insight and higher values. Jesus's teachings are, that is a great aspirational story and character, and values that I think can be beneficial for people and society as a whole. Um, so I'm definitely more
right.
religion friendly in that way. um, and even in my personal life, I go, back and forth about that. I'm still kind of deciding. It's just hard for me intellectually to wrap my head around. But then I'm like, okay, well, there's just so much about the nature of reality that is inexplicable, and my little meat brain is not going to understand it anyway, no matter what. So like maybe I can just come to terms with that and like be like maybe like an agnostic-ish like Christian, or I've like dabbled in stuff like that, but that's a whole
Right.
other.
Well, I think that's a very wise perspective, because I think an element of humility before the awesome project of trying to understand God. I mean, like, I think
Literally
like,
the most awesome project.
people who are, yeah, I think they're a little arrogant sometimes in terms of like, oh yeah, I totally understand God, no big deal. Like I got it all figured out. No, but yeah, it's like I have all the answers,
Mhm.
like And yeah, I think a little humility before, these religious projects. And you're right, also ritual. I think,
Mm,
like ritual is a very important aspect of, and I think that's something that we sort of lost in our modern society. There's sort of in general the modern worldview post enlightenment, it's, we have all this modern technology and scientific understanding of, we we understand the Big Bang and evolution and, deep time understanding that, like, the universe is billions of years old. And it's sort of like the world has become disenchanted for the modern person. and,
mm,
and you know one of the ways to re-enchant the world is through rituals, but
mm,
we sort of lost that, I think, a bit. And people are trying to like recover, because even in the atheist community there's this whole thing. I don't know if you remember this, but there's the like new atheists, they try to get this whole thing of like atheist church started,
oh
where
yeah,
they're like meet every Sunday and they like read poems about nature and and
I like
stuff, and
the
like
idea.
it's
Like
like
I think that's
yeah,
onto something. And you see, like there's like Unitarian Universalist like churches. Like I think that does really serve probably a critical point purpose for a healthy, flourishing community would be to reconvene and reflect on higher values, share stories of overcoming, connect with your community. Like having that happen once a week, I just think is probably so invaluable to like human well-being when it's so easy, especially post COVID. Everyone's working from home and like we're only
right,
just now like getting back out in the world. And I feel like things are improving. Like, I work in a
yeah,
restaurant and I'm seeing people out in the world, but I also am talking to a lot of people who work from home and they do feel very isolated and like their life lacks purpose. And even just the ritual of getting up, leaving for work, going, like those mini rituals that we have during our day are gone. And we're kind of feeling that loss and the
yeah,
space that creates
totally,
in our lives that we have to now fill up with something else.
yeah.
Uh,
I also think another aspect that I think gets at this sort of evolved religious impulse we all have as humans is, people talk about, I'm not the first one to talk about, there's this guy, Andrew Weil. He's like
I don't know if I know him.
he wrote this book a long time ago that was a very influential on me, where he basically says like there's these basic drives for in like humans as animals. There's a drive, the four F's, like food, fucking, whatever, you know what I'm saying,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
these
yeah,
basic
yeah,
drives.
yeah.
Well, he thought another drive that's core to the human nature, that we all have this basic drive, is the drive to alter our consciousness,
Mm,
which explains why, for example, 5-year-old kids, they spin in circles to get dizzy, for the sheer hell of it, because
mm,
they enjoy altering their consciousness. It's why, we like doing drugs
yeah,
as
yeah.
as like humans. Why humans, fast for like a month to experience these like alternate consciousness. Why,
Mm,
they go to like the drum circle. Why they take psychedelics. We sort of our whole, and like in the ancient past, like re- religious rituals, the like Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece were about imbibing like soma, which is a psychedelic substance. These ancient pagan rites about transforming your consciousness. And I think that the strive to alter our consciousness is baked into the human nature. And
absolutely.
so I think, that's an, and that's why we meditate, and why people buy headspace,
Right.
like, and so yeah, I don't know, I think that's another way to re-enchant the and I've struggled with this too, because I've struggled with like cannabis addiction for like my
Dude,
whole life, with my whole life. And I'm
I
like
feel you on that.
trying to go sober.
Good for you.
Um,
I that's a
yeah,
very serious, like, I've struggled with a lot of substances and currently I'm only like smoking weed and drinking, but already the weed, there are points with me where the weed escalates to the point where I do have to stop. And like, luckily it's not an out of control substance that I love. It's not my drug of choice, my number one drug of choice. So I'm able to do that with weed, but it does escalate, and I'm right on the cusp of that lately because I've been getting those vape pens that are so strong. And when I do the vape
Right.
pen, it's just so easy to do it all the time. And then all of a sudden my tolerance goes up. All of a sudden I'm buying more and more. And then I'm like this, I'm like a junkie all over again. And like
Yeah.
luckily there isn't that
I
physical
was,
withdrawal, but it can be a
yeah.
very real addiction for sure.
Yeah. I was never able to moderate. I'd be like, I would go for like 3 months, like, oh, I'm not addicted. I don't have a problem with like
Mm,
cannabis. And then like, then I like, oh, like I deserve to. I'll just buy like one little gummy. I'll just get high like
mhm.
once, and then like a week later, I'm doing it every day, and and
Yeah.
it's like, and yeah, the tolerance, and it becomes obsessive, and it just starts impacting like my work,
Yeah, it can really
and like
affect, like for me, I weed makes me, it lowers my energy, but I lean maybe too energetic, like in the way that I interact. So I notice when I'm not smoking weed, a lot of people are kind of telling me to tone it down a notch. Like, so like I kind of started smoking again. I'm like, maybe this just equalizes me better in the way that I interact, but I'm so much more productive and on it and like focused and articulate and just everything is working and firing so much faster when I'm not smoking every day that, it can
right.
definitely be an issue for sure.
Yeah, I've been studying Christian theology a lot lately and trying to understand like what is the nature of sin as like an
Mm,
ontological category, and the way it's often discussed in the Bible, at least as far as like the Apostle Paul. I think there's very good biblical evidence that sin is really getting at the human propensity for addiction and habit forming behaviors,
mm,
and like the human body just in general, like our dopamine circuits, we're like wired for habit. We are like, as William James said, like we are bundles of habits. Our entire human brain, the dopamine circuits, the motivation circuits, the
mm,
basic brain mechanisms for driving behavior to get us to do things, like it fundamentally is based on this like propensity for habits, and like there's way more ways to develop bad habits than good habits. So
yeah.
even if you like give up all drugs, like maybe now you're addicted to food, and so like or shopping or whatever
I've
else,
trained my addiction is, like,
or
transferred.
Twitter.
Dude, my like, literally, when I would stop one drug, then it'd be, like, food. I go too hard with that. Now I'm addicted to exercising. Now I'm addicted to my phone. Like, it's always something to the point where I just have to hack that and try to get myself addicted to healthy behaviors and, just try not to go too crazy with them, Like,
Right.
I have
Yeah. So
such, as you see, I'm smoking. I'm addiction is such a core issue of mine that like I've gotten to a manageable point, but still really does kind of run my life. And like I can't sit down and do a freaking live stream without smoking 8 cigarettes and drink my Diet Coke. And I'm always, doing something that takes me out of the moment. I'm just so trapped in that cycle. But
yeah,
it's
I
a lot
think
better
I
than it
think
was
it
a year ago. I'm not doing
yeah,
fentanyl
yeah.
and crack. So it's like,
I've watched some of your videos on your story of addiction. Like, yeah,
yeah.
you have a powerful story in regards to that. Like,
Thank you.
yeah,
Thank you. I mean,
so
I
um
really loved that I was able to share things and people relate to that. That I found that to be really fulfilling to me personally. It makes me feel like, it's not all just a waste. Like ideally, because the way that we make decisions is so fickle and addicts are so fickle that you never know what's going to actually push them to get sober. Like, so if I can maybe nudge someone just a little bit in that direction, like that, that's great for me. Like, that makes me feel
yeah,
great. Like,
yeah, no, that's like really, really admirable, I think, because I think, you know, addicts sort of reveal the human condition in a
mm,
way that is obvious, but they reveal things about human nature that for a lot of people, their addictions are not as obvious. Like
mm,
if you're addicted to Twitter, which I think a
mhm.
lot of people are, seriously, like
Absolutely,
no cap. I
absolute.
mean,
It's a
like
very
that,
addictive substance.
yeah,
Like that and
yeah,
TikTok, some of these apps are specifically very addictive. Like, they just
no, for
are.
sure.
Fact.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these companies hire neuroscientists who study addiction in rats in order to optimize the algorithm to precisely
Mhm,
ping the notifications in the algorithm to addict us. I mean, it is a science. They have it down
mhm.
to a literal science at the level of neuronal spiking activity in terms of
Yes.
maximal addiction.
And of course they
And
do, because there's a huge profit motive to
yeah,
hack people into these little attention machines, like,
yeah,
it's very lucrative to do, so they're gonna keep doing it, but people just
yeah,
have to outsmart it, or, just be proactive about. I just feel like there's like, and I'm just talking specifically, this is all very much just like America, Western society, my experience, like, the world over has a million other bigger, different issues, but I just feel like the West is so sick right now. I just feel like there's this overwhelming sense of sickness, malaise, unhappiness, dysfunction. I just feel like so much is coming to a head, like, the
yeah.
fentanyl epidemic killing 100,000 people a year.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
my brother died of an opiate, overdose, like, 2 years ago.
Holy shit. I'm so sorry to hear that.
So yeah, it's like a issue near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, it's most people
So
don't make it out. I've lost a brother too, so I know how life-wrecking that is.
yeah,
It's I it's horrific, and so many families are being destroyed, and, in my experience with the institutions and facilities that we have to help people are just very lacking. But there are, good things, and I'm very pro, like, harm reduction, because 'cause I'm someone who I used to actually be, like, kinda judgmental of, like, methadone and things like that, but in the end, that ended up getting me off fentanyl because I could not get on Suboxone. I had these issues getting on Suboxone, and I had these issues of just getting off it completely. I tried many times, and it's it's like the most evil substance in the world. It, like, gives you everything that a happy life would give you just instantly, while taking your soul, taking your health, taking your life, destroying you until it kills you, and it's horrific. It is absolutely horrific, and I just feel like there's just so many. It's just one manifestation of, like, an overall sickness and unhappiness in modern society.
yeah. Well, this is why I think a lot of people when they hear Christians talk about sin, they, like, connect it to these, like, things like, I don't know, being gay or something.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
And, like, when we think of sin, that's what we think about, but it's like sin really refers to that inborn disposition for that sickness, for that malaise that is infecting
Yes.
all of society in terms of our human condition. We have a fundamental disposition and tendency towards brokenness
Mhm,
unless there are intervening factors in our
mhm,
modern society. We don't have checks and balances. Like we're not living in little villages of
mhm,
150 people where, all of our, we're not like suffering from loneliness,
mhm,
and we're not struggling to raise our child
mm,
by ourselves because we have a whole extended family, and
yeah,
the like a communal sense and like a worldview that like provides the ultimate sense of purpose and how we
mhm,
fit into the world and what is our meaning, and like we've lost all that. That's like the
yeah,
original function of like religion.
yeah,
um
and that's
so
where the conservatism comes in, is that, eh, sometimes we do need to conserve certain things that maybe if we didn't intuitively understand their purpose in society, now that they're gone, we are seeing what that purpose was, and we're seeing that they were fulfilling a role and serving something in people that is fundamental, and we have to figure out some kinda, like, alternate way of fulfilling those needs, or whether it's like a return of religion, of other institutions, more like maybe communal living, like, because I do think that's kind of like the environment people are most happy. Like, say, if I could like design my own little perfect world, I'd maybe live like in a village of a bunch of little houses, and with like a common area, and it's a large community of people. Like, I don't just that
right.
that that mode
Yeah,
of
I mean
living,
the
instead of like.
polyamorous commune, like dream of every like leftist in the world.
Literally, yes. I mean, that was,
Yeah.
like, my plan for a long time. I was like, "I'm gonna start a commune," and I tried running away to, like, work on, like, a farm, and, it was a disaster, so I'm selling out, I'm doing the normal life, That's
Yeah.
my game
I
plan right
mean,
now.
I'm a little bit of a pessimist in this regard because although I do feel like, Christianity can help, I think, yeah, I think there's like Pandora's box has been opened and you can't
Mm,
put the cat back in the bag as far as like the modern atomistic digital world. I mean, look at us here. Like this is our socialization. This is our community.
yeah.
Like we're just like these dissing, these talking heads on a
Mhm.
digital stream over the internet. But
It's, like,
you
both
know,
really cool that we can do that, but, like, it gives, like, this fix of socialization without the full experience, and that can actually keep people more trapped, like, because I felt like, "Oh, I'm getting a social fix online," but it doesn't nourish you in the same way that when you like, I think who knows what hormones and stuff, because you just physically need to be around other people, and I think on, like, a chemical level, you can feel the isolation starts to eat away at you and your health, like, and
right,
we're seeing a huge uptick just in, like, health conditions, and it's
right,
it's weird. The more, like, productive and
yeah,
rich this country gets, the seems like the less happy people are, at least statistically from what I've seen and from what
yeah.
I've observed in, like, my life, but
But I honestly don't think we're ever going to return to the idyllic life of the noble
mm,
savages, and because like, yeah, like the internet, it's too powerful, it's too
mhm,
useful, it's too
mm,
ingrained, like it's too much a part. I mean, I think we're entering into a new evolutionary period of time
yeah,
such that they, e- evolution is about adapting to our environment. Well, the environment we have to adapt to as humans is a digital one.
mm,
It is a cyborg reality that we have to adapt to, and I think there's always going to be people who go off to their communes, but that's not scalable.
mhm,
So I think what we're doing now is like to some extent like that is the new model, and it's like
true,
so I think like but luckily the human's brain is incredibly plastic, incredibly
yes,
flexible,
yes,
so we are capable of adapting to this new reality. um but you know it's the problem is like the change is happening so rapidly that a lot of us are falling behind. Just look at how we're adapting to like the modern diet of the Americans. Like
mm,
we're not adapting fast enough to that
no.
diet, and like people are suffering from it. But um so yeah, I don't know, it's a brave new world.
Literally, but I know we're coming up on, like, a little over 2 hours, which I love.
Yeah,
I feel like I could talk to you forever because there's just a million little like, you're very, very interesting person to talk to. You have a lot of interesting information just, like, on tap, and on top of that, you've had a very interesting life experience that gives you a very unique insight. But I don't wanna, monopolize your whole night. I thought it was so awesome that, in short notice, we were able to make this work, but
yeah, totally. I mean, I think we've covered a lot of good
yeah,
ground. It
yeah, I
was a good
know.
conversation, so I'm at a happy point. I feel like we could stop here, and I'd be
Yeah,
like
yeah, I
happy
feel
with
we covered
the
a lot of stuff,
conversation. So
but, that's the kind of conversations I like listening to are ones that are fluid and just, like just as if we were just talking at a bar or something, just, like, a real natural, nuanced, and, vulnerable conversation is it's the vibe. Um,
yeah, totally.
yeah, so, yeah, thank you so much. It was super great talking to you. I'd love to have you on again. Um, 'Cause I could talk to you about anything, and if you wanna
Yeah.
talk about your plug your channel, plug your book or anything, I'm here.
Um, I'm on Twitter and YouTube, Ray Alex Williams. So,
Nice
and
shout out.
and since you're on my channel
Oh,
streaming,
yeah, yeah.
you
So
can share.
I'm we're so bad at this. You can tell we're, like, not, like, good at streaming or no, we're good at streaming, but, like, I'm just not a streaming pro at all. So I always am like, "What do
Yeah,
people normally do at the end?" But yeah, Ruby SpaceX everywhere. I'm on most the apps, and alright, I guess I will you're the main host, so maybe I
yeah.
don't know how
I
that
I I I think I have the power to end this. So okay, all
you are
right.
the
See ya.
power. The man has the power.